By the FBI's own account, the trip to Milan was official business. Meetings with international law enforcement partners, coordination with allied agencies, the sort of diplomatic and security work that would justify putting the director of the FBI on a taxpayer-funded government aircraft and sending him across the Atlantic. But according to photos taken that very same night, the director of the FBI was standing inside the Team USA hockey locker room with a beer in his hand while a gold medal hung around his neck. Both of those facts exist in the public record, and both of them do not sit comfortably side by side. That contradiction is where this story starts. Because what happened inside the House Homeland Security Committee hearing room was not a routine congressional back and forth about travel reimbursements or calendar logistics. This was not the kind of hearing where lawmakers read prepared remarks, witnesses offer careful answers, and the whole thing ends with polite applause in an empty hallway. This was a moment when documents met silence. More specifically, 92 seconds of silence. 92 seconds between the moment Congressman Benny Thompson placed a printed legal complaint on the witness table and the moment FBI Director Kash Patel stopped speaking altogether, pressed both hands flat against the wood in front of him, and sat there while his attorney tried twice to step in and twice failed to save the moment. 92 seconds may not sound like much when you see it written on a screen. But in a congressional hearing room, with cameras rolling and microphones live, it feels endless. But to understand why those 92 seconds mattered, you first have to understand what document Congressman Thompson brought with him that morning and why it was unlike every other line of questioning Kash Patel had faced in 17 months of congressional hearings. The document did not come from a political campaign. It did not come from an opposition research shop. It did not come from a rival member of Congress chasing a viral moment. It came from the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan legal organization that has spent decades filing oversight complaints against officials in both parties. The organization has sued Democrats and Republicans, more to cabinet secretaries and campaign committees, members of Congress and presidential administrations. Their reputation in Washington is straightforward. When they file a complaint, they file it with documentation. 4 days before this hearing, the Campaign Legal Center submitted a 34-page legal complaint to the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General. That filing was not a press release. It was not a political allegation. It was a formal trigger. Under federal oversight rules, when the Inspector General receives a complaint like that, the office has to log it, evaluate it, and determine whether it merits an investigation. It creates a paper trail inside the Department of Justice that cannot simply be ignored or quietly shoved aside. That is the document Benny Thompson carried into the committee room. And the complaint contained something that makes investigators pay attention. Receipts, 10 of them. 10 documented flights taken by the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on taxpayer-funded aircraft. 10 trips that the complaint describes as personal travel for which reimbursement either did not happen, did not match the operational cost of the aircraft, or raised questions about whether federal travel rules were properly followed. Now, if you have watched congressional hearings before, you know how exchanges like this usually go. A lawmaker asks a question. A witness gives a carefully worded explanation about regulations and procedures. Staff lawyers swap notes, and the conversation drifts into bureaucratic language until the cameras move on. That is how most of the earlier hearings involving Kash Patel had played out. Whenever travel questions came up, Patel had a prepared answer ready. He explained that federal regulations allow senior officials to reimburse the government for personal travel at the price of a commercial airline ticket, even when they're flying on a government aircraft that costs far more to operate. That rule exists for practical reasons. The director of the FBI travels with security personnel, communications equipment, and a schedule that cannot always fit commercial airline service. So the reimbursement standard is based on the price of an equivalent commercial ticket. Patel had repeated that explanation so many times in earlier hearings that it had become almost automatic. Commercial ticket price, fully compliant with regulations. Personal reimbursement submitted. Every time the question came up, the answer sounded the same. Until this hearing. Because Congressman Benny Thompson did not begin with a broad accusation. He did not open with a speech. He did something much more methodical. He placed the complaint on the table in front of Kash Patel without lifting it for the cameras. He did not read from it. He simply turned it face up so the header was visible. Campaign Legal Center complaint to the DOJ Inspector General. March 4th, 2026. Subject: FBI Director Kash Patel, personal travel on government aircraft. Then Thompson looked directly at Patel and said something very simple. Director, I want to ask you about page 14. There was no drama in his voice, no theatrical flourish. That is how Benny Thompson conducts hearings. For decades, he has questioned law enforcement officials, intelligence officers, was cabinet secretaries, and witnesses under oath in committees responsible for national security oversight. He does not shout. He does not rush. He asks questions slowly enough that the person sitting across from him knows exactly what is being asked. And on page 14 of that complaint was a specific event. December 2025, a mass shooting at Brown University. According to the complaint, an FBI evidence response team needed to reach Providence, Rhode Island, as quickly as possible to help with the investigation. Normally, that kind of deployment relies on Bureau aircraft when time is critical. But that night, the complaint says something unusual happened. Both FBI jets were unavailable. One aircraft was already being used by other FBI personnel. The other aircraft was being held in South Florida under instructions tied to travel by the director. So the evidence response team did not fly. They drove through a snowstorm overnight across hundreds of miles of winter roads because the aircraft they would normally have used were not available. When Thompson got to that section of the document, he did not dramatize it. He summarized it calmly and then asked one question. Director Patel, on the night of a mass shooting at Brown University, an FBI evidence team drove through a snowstorm because the aircraft were unavailable. Is that account accurate? What happened next is where the timeline really begins. Patel looked down at the complaint. His attorney leaned forward slightly. The room was quiet. For 12 seconds, no one said a word. Then Kash Patel started answering. He said the sequence described in the complaint did not accurately reflect operational aircraft management procedures. He said the FBI always makes sure resources remain available for urgent investigative needs. He said the evidence response team ultimately reached the scene and completed their work. Each sentence sounded careful. Each phrase sounded practiced. But Congressman Thompson was not done. He waited for Patel to finish the explanation. Then he placed another piece of paper on the table. It was a reimbursement record. The document showed that Kash Patel had reimbursed the government $218 for a trip taken on an FBI aircraft to State College, Pennsylvania, for a professional wrestling event where Alexis Wilkins, Patel's girlfriend, performed the national anthem. The aircraft used for that trip was a Gulfstream G550. Operational cost per flight, approximately $45,000. Reimbursement submitted, $218. Thompson slid the paper next to the complaint. Then he said something that changed the tone of the room completely. Director, a previous FBI director, was fired for doing this. The reference was not subtle. In 1993, President Bill Clinton removed FBI Director William Sessions after a Justice Department investigation concluded that Sessions had used government aircraft for personal travel and reimbursed the government only at commercial ticket rates. The controversy became a national scandal. And now, 33 years later, the same comparison was sitting on the witness table in front of Kash Patel. 4 pieces of evidence in a row. The official claim that the Milan trip was government business. A photograph from the Olympic locker room showing Patel celebrating with athletes. The reimbursement record for $218. And the whistleblower account describing an FBI team driving through a blizzard because the aircraft were unavailable. Congressman Thompson did not raise his voice. He simply asked the question, Director Patel, why did you do what William Sessions was fired for doing? For a moment, Kash Patel looked exactly the way witnesses often look when they realize the next answer cannot solve the problem sitting in front of them. You could almost see the calculation run through his head: defend the reimbursement rule, challenge the complaint, dismiss the comparison. Every option crashed into the documents lying on the table, so he chose the only answer he still had left. Patel said, My travel practices have been fully compliant with federal regulations, and I reject the characterization presented in that complaint. It was the kind of answer that might have worked in earlier hearings, but the room had already seen the documents. And that is when the silence started building toward those 92 seconds, because Congressman Thompson had one more piece of evidence left to place on the table. And that final document was the one that turned a bureaucratic argument about travel reimbursements into something much harder to brush aside. Because until that moment, the discussion could still be framed as a technical dispute. Regulations, accounting procedures, interpretations of reimbursement rules most Americans never read and never think about. At least in theory, it was still possible to argue that everything came down to a bureaucratic gray area inside the federal travel code. Then Congressman Benny Thompson placed a fourth document on the table. It was not a receipt. It was not a reimbursement form. It was a written account provided to Congress by a whistleblower describing what happened on the night of the shooting at Brown University. The account was precise: dates, timestamps, internal communication logs, the kind of details investigators inside federal agencies recognize immediately because they match the way operational reports are written. It described the moment an FBI evidence response team tried to secure aircraft support so they could reach Providence quickly after the shooting. And it described what they were told: no aircraft available, one jet already deployed, the other jet being held in South Florida at the time. According to the complaint filed with the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General, that aircraft was connected to travel arrangements for FBI Director Kash Patel. So the team drove. They drove through a winter storm. Hours on the highway in the dark while snow piled up along the roadside, and visibility dropped the way it does in northeastern storms, where wind turns falling snow into a wall of white that swallows headlights. By the time they reached Providence the next morning, the investigation had already started without them. Now picture that scene for a moment, because this is where the hearing stopped being about aircraft costs and started becoming about something else entirely. Inside the hearing room in Washington, the director of the FBI was defending travel reimbursements that totaled $218 for a trip on an aircraft that costs $45,000 to operate. Outside Washington, somewhere on an interstate in the middle of a snowstorm months earlier, federal investigators were driving through the night because the aircraft they would normally rely on were unavailable. That contrast did not need rhetorical embellishment. It was already there in the documents. And that is the moment Congressman Thompson turned the hearing from technical oversight into prosecutorial logic. He did not accuse, he did not editorialize, he simply stacked the evidence again. First, the complaint filed by the Campaign Legal Center, describing 10 personal trips taken on government aircraft. Second, the reimbursement record showing $218 returned to the government for one of those flights. Third, the historical precedent involving former FBI Director William Sessions, who was dismissed for using Bureau aircraft for personal travel while reimbursing only at commercial ticket rates. And fourth, the whistleblower account from the Brown University response. 4 documents in a line. 4 pieces of paper that together formed a narrative no speech could improve. If you watched the hearing live, you could see the moment when Kash Patel realized the conversation had moved beyond travel policy and into something more dangerous. Because what Thompson had built was not just a timeline, it was a moral comparison. On one side of the table sat the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation explaining reimbursement rules. On the other side of the table sat the image of investigators driving through a blizzard to reach the aftermath of a mass shooting. And when those two images collide in a congressional hearing, the question changes. It is no longer simply did the paperwork comply with the rule. It becomes, what did that decision mean in the real world? Congressman Thompson understood that difference. For decades, he has served on committees responsible for national security oversight, and those committees operate under a principle prosecutors recognize immediately. Context matters. A rule that looks legal in isolation can look very different when placed next to the consequences of how it was used. So Thompson returned to the central issue again. Director Patel, he said, the reimbursement record shows $218. He paused. The operational cost of that aircraft is approximately $45,000. Another pause. Do you believe that reimbursement reflects the real cost of that flight to the taxpayer? Now, this is where the internal contradiction inside Patel's earlier defenses began to break down. Because throughout previous hearings, he had relied on a single explanation. Federal regulations require reimbursement at the price of a commercial ticket, not the operational cost of the aircraft. Technically, that statement is correct. But the moment the Brown University incident entered the conversation, the technical explanation started sounding incomplete. The law may allow reimbursement based on commercial ticket prices, but the aircraft itself still costs tens of thousands of dollars to operate. Why? And if that aircraft is unavailable when investigators need it during an emergency, the question shifts from legality to judgment. That is the difference between compliance and leadership. Patel responded carefully. He repeated that his travel practices were fully compliant with federal regulations. He emphasized that the FBI maintains operational readiness. He rejected the characterization presented in the complaint. The words sounded measured, but there was something different in his voice now. The confident authority that had carried him through earlier hearings had softened into something more cautious, more defensive, as if every sentence was being weighed against the documents in front of him. And Congressman Thompson noticed. So he went back to the first contradiction. "Director," he said, "the Bureau stated that the Milan trip was official business." Then he lifted another sheet of paper. This one contained a still image printed from a widely circulated video taken inside the Team USA locker room during the Winter Olympics celebration. In the image, Kash Patel is standing among players wearing a gold medal around his neck and holding a beer. The scene itself is not illegal. No one was suggesting that attending an Olympic event violates federal law, but the image collided directly with the description of the trip as official law enforcement business. Thompson placed the photograph next to the reimbursement record, next to the complaint, next to the whistleblower account. 4 documents again: official business, Olympic locker room photograph, $218 reimbursement, snowstorm. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Yet not Thompson, not Patel, not the attorneys seated behind him. That silence was not accidental. In congressional hearings, experienced lawmakers understand the power of quiet moments. When the evidence has already been laid out, speaking too quickly can weaken the effect. Silence forces everyone in the room to look at the documents and make the connection for themselves. And that is exactly what happened. Cameras pushed in slightly closer to the witness table. Staff members along the back wall stopped whispering to each other. Somewhere in the room, a pen stopped moving. Kash Patel looked down at the documents. Then he looked back up at Congressman Thompson. The expression on his face had changed. Earlier in the hearing, he had worn the composed look of a witness confident the conversation would stay inside the safe boundaries of policy explanations. Now that expression had tightened into something more analytical, the look of someone calculating the risks in every possible answer. His attorney leaned forward and whispered something in his ear. Patel nodded once. Then he spoke again. "Congressman," he said, "I would request the opportunity to provide the committee with a full written accounting of my travel record and reimbursements, rather than respond to characterizations from a complaint filed by an external organization." It was a strategic response. Asking for time moves the discussion out of a live hearing and into written correspondence, where answers can be drafted more carefully. But the phrasing contained one word that immediately caught Thompson's attention: external. The Campaign Legal Center was being described as an outside organization, suggesting political motivation, and that description did not survive the next question, because Thompson knew the history of that organization and he knew exactly how to dismantle that argument. Because the word external sounded harmless at first. It sounded procedural, almost technical. The kind of word government witnesses often use when they want to suggest a complaint did not originate inside the official oversight structure of Congress. But Congressman Benny Thompson understood exactly what Kash Patel was trying to do with that phrasing, so he corrected it immediately. The complaint, Thompson said calmly, was filed by the Campaign Legal Center. He paused for just a moment, the way experienced investigators pause before adding the next piece of context. They have filed complaints against officials in both parties for decades. Another pause. They are not an external political organization in the sense you are implying. It was a surgical correction. No raised voice, no accusation, just a clarification placed directly into the congressional record. The reason that clarification mattered is because of how the oversight process inside the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General actually works. When a complaint like this reaches the Inspector General's office, the process that follows is not optional. The office is required to document the filing, evaluate the allegations, and determine whether a formal investigation should be opened. Even if the complaint is eventually dismissed, the fact that it was filed creates an official record inside the Department of Justice, which means something very important. This was not simply a political argument playing out inside a hearing room. It was the public beginning of a documented oversight process that would continue long after the cameras shut off. And Congressman Thompson wanted that reality stated clearly in the record. So he picked up the complaint again and turned to another section. Director Patel, he said, the complaint notes that former FBI Director Robert Mueller took 7 wholly personal flights in 4 years. Then he looked directly across the table. You have taken at least 10 in under 1 year. The comparison landed exactly the way it was meant to, because Mueller's tenure as FBI director had become synonymous with institutional caution. During some of the most politically turbulent years in modern American law enforcement history, Mueller maintained a reputation for procedural discipline, careful documentation, and strict attention to the optics of federal authority. By placing Mueller's numbers next to Patel's numbers, Thompson was doing something subtle but powerful. He was reframing the conversation from individual trips to institutional standards. The issue was no longer just whether Kash Patel had followed the technical reimbursement rule. The issue was whether the director of the FBI had exercised the level of judgment expected from someone entrusted with the authority of that office. And that distinction matters because the FBI director is not merely a traveler on government aircraft. The director is the steward of an institution that depends heavily on public trust. Every decision made by that office is interpreted through the lens of credibility. When federal agents execute a search warrant, when prosecutors file charges, when intelligence officials share sensitive information with international partners, they do so under the umbrella of the Bureau's reputation for integrity. That reputation is not written into any statute, but it is one of the most valuable assets the institution has. And inside that hearing room, Congressman Thompson was raising a question that went far beyond travel reimbursements. What happens when the public begins to question whether the person leading the FBI is using government resources in ways that look indistinguishable from personal privilege? The answer to that question has historical precedent. In 1993, President Bill Clinton removed FBI Director William Sessions after a Justice Department investigation concluded that Sessions had misused Bureau aircraft for personal trips, while reimbursing the government using the same commercial ticket pricing standard Kash Patel was now citing. Technically legal, politically indefensible. The distinction between those two ideas has always defined how ethics investigations unfold in Washington. Because the law sets minimum standards, but public institutions survive on higher ones. Thompson knew that history, and he put it into the hearing without theatrics. The same year Director Sessions was removed, he said, "You were 13 years old." The line was not meant as an insult, it was meant as a reminder. The precedent had existed for more than 3 decades, which meant that every FBI director who followed Sessions had been fully aware of how sensitive the issue of aircraft use could become. And yet, the complaint now sitting on the witness table alleged at least 10 trips taken by Kash Patel within a single year. 10 trips. Some tied to international travel, some tied to private resorts, some tied to visits with his girlfriend Alexis Wilkins in Nashville, and 1 trip to State College, Pennsylvania, for a professional wrestling event where she performed the national anthem. Every one of those trips carried a reimbursement record calculated at the price of a commercial airline ticket. $200 here, $300 there. Numbers that look perfectly ordinary until you place them next to the operational cost of a Gulfstream aircraft. $45,000. And that is where the logic of the hearing began to tighten around Patel's earlier explanations. Because compliance with the reimbursement rule answered only part of the question. It explained how the payment was calculated. It did not explain the judgment behind choosing to use the aircraft in the first place. That distinction may sound subtle, but in oversight hearings, it is often the entire case. Imagine a police officer who technically follows department policy while repeatedly making decisions that create avoidable risks. Each individual action may fall within the rulebook, but the pattern begins to raise a larger question about discretion. Mock congressional oversight works the same way. Patterns matter. And Congressman Thompson had just placed 10 of them into the record. Across the witness table, Kash Patel understood that the conversation had reached a point where repeating the same compliance explanation would no longer move the hearing forward. He looked down again at the documents lined up in front of him. Official business, Olympic locker room photograph, $218 reimbursement, Brown University snowstorm. 10 trips listed in a complaint now sitting with the Department of Justice Inspector General. That stack of evidence had become impossible to ignore. For the first time since the hearing began, Patel did something he had rarely done in previous sessions. He stopped speaking completely, not for a second, not for the brief pauses that happen when witnesses search for the right wording. He simply stopped, both hands flat on the table, eyes moving slowly across the documents in front of him. His attorney leaned forward again and whispered something, clearly trying to prompt the next response. But Patel remained silent. 5 seconds passed, 10 seconds, 15. In Washington hearing rooms, silence like that spreads through the space like a ripple through water. Members of Congress shift slightly in their chairs. Staff members stop typing. The gallery leans forward almost imperceptibly. Everyone senses the same thing at the same moment. The witness has run out of answers. By the time Kash Patel finally spoke again, the confident tone that had defined his earlier testimony was gone. What replaced it was something quieter, more careful. "Congressman," he said, "I would welcome the opportunity to provide the committee with a comprehensive written accounting of my travel record and reimbursements." It was not a denial. It was not an explanation. It was a request for time. And in congressional hearings, requests for time often signal that the immediate conversation cannot be resolved in the room. Thompson looked at him for a long moment before responding. Then he closed the complaint and set it back down on the table. "I have no further questions," he said. But by the time he said that, the hearing had already changed, because those 4 documents sitting side by side on that witness table were now part of the official congressional record. And within minutes, they would begin moving far beyond the walls of that hearing room. And once those documents entered the congressional record, they started traveling faster than anyone inside that hearing room could control. That is how Washington works in the age of digital reporting. A moment that unfolds slowly inside a committee chamber can race across the country in minutes once the evidence becomes visible. Staff members share transcripts with reporters. Journalists compare notes with legal analysts. News desks start building headlines before the gavel even falls. By the time the hearing resumed its ordinary rhythm, the story had already started slipping out of the room. 4 documents, 4 images, 4 questions that could not be easily explained away. The official claimed that the Milan trip was government business. The photograph of FBI Director Kash Patel inside the Olympic locker room, holding a beer with a gold medal around his neck. The reimbursement record showing $218 returned to the government for a flight that cost approximately $45,000 to operate. And the whistleblower account describing an FBI evidence response team driving through a snowstorm after a mass shooting at Brown University because aircraft were unavailable. Placed side by side, those documents told a story that did not need commentary. They told a story about priorities. Inside the hearing room, however, the hearing continued the way hearings always do. Other members of the committee still had questions prepared. The agenda still included subjects like border security, counterterrorism strategy, and the Bureau's staffing levels. Congressional oversight is structured that way on purpose. No single exchange is allowed to completely overtake the proceeding. The committee still has to do its work. So the next member began speaking. Questions shifted to intelligence coordination. Statistics on domestic extremism were read into the record. Kash Patel gradually regained his composure as the conversation moved away from the travel complaint and back toward familiar territory, where witnesses can rely on prepared briefing notes and policy explanations. But the earlier moment had already changed the atmosphere in the room. Because once evidence has been laid out in that kind of sequence, everyone present understands the hearing is no longer just a policy discussion. It has become part of a broader investigation. And outside the hearing room, that broader investigation had already begun to unfold. Reporters started comparing the timeline of Kash Patel's travel with the timeline described in the complaint filed by the Campaign Legal Center. Legal analysts began revisiting the historical precedent involving former FBI Director William Sessions. In 1993, the Department of Justice concluded that Sessions had misused Bureau aircraft for personal trips while reimbursing the government only at commercial ticket rates. The Justice Department investigation described that practice in language that echoed almost word for word in the complaint now filed against Kash Patel, using government aircraft for personal travel, characterizing the trips as official business, reimbursing the government using a calculation that did not reflect the actual operational cost of the aircraft. Only 33 years separated those two moments, but the pattern looked strikingly familiar. And that is why the comparison began showing up across national news coverage before the hearing had even ended. William Sessions removed from office after an ethics investigation. Kash Patel, 10 documented trips within a single year. Reimbursements calculated at commercial ticket prices rather than operational cost. And now a formal complaint sitting inside the U.S. Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General. The Inspector General's office had not yet announced an investigation, but the filing itself guaranteed the issue would be examined. That is the whole purpose of the oversight system. Complaints create records, records create questions, questions create investigations, and investigations create consequences. Now, inside Washington, those consequences rarely arrive overnight. The process moves slowly, guided by procedures designed to protect due process and institutional stability. But the public conversation moves much faster. Within hours, commentators were already asking the question Congressman Benny Thompson had quietly placed at the center of the hearing. What standard should apply to the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation? The minimum legal standard written into federal travel regulations? Or the higher ethical standard historically expected from the head of the nation's most powerful law enforcement agency? Because the director of the FBI holds a unique position inside the American system of government. Federal agents enforce laws involving organized crime, public corruption, financial fraud, and national security threats. They investigate powerful people. They gather evidence. They testify in courtrooms where the credibility of the Bureau often becomes the deciding factor in whether juries believe the government's case. All of that authority depends on a simple assumption that the institution itself follows the same rules it enforces. When that assumption starts to crack, even slightly, the consequences ripple outward. Defense attorneys begin asking harder questions in court. Foreign intelligence partners become more cautious about sharing sensitive information. Members of Congress increase the pressure in oversight hearings, and the public begins to wonder whether the rules apply equally to everyone inside the system. That is why moments like the one that unfolded during those 92 seconds matter. Not because a reimbursement record showed $218, not because a photograph captured a gold medal celebration inside a locker room, and not even because an evidence response team drove through a snowstorm to reach a crime scene. Those details matter because together they raise a larger question about judgment. Judgment in the use of public resources. Judgment in the exercise of institutional authority. Judgment in the leadership of an agency that carries extraordinary power. By the time the hearing ended and the committee chairman brought down the gavel, the documents Congressman Thompson had placed on the table were already circulating through newsrooms, legal offices, and congressional staff briefings across Washington. The 92 seconds of silence had become the defining image of the entire session. A director of the FBI sitting in front of 4 pieces of evidence. A congressman waiting patiently for an answer that never fully came. And a complaint now sitting inside the Department of Justice oversight system, waiting for investigators to decide what comes next. Because that is the final truth about moments like this. Hearings end, but records remain. Investigations begin quietly. Documents are reviewed. Witnesses are contacted. And eventually the system decides whether what happened was merely controversial or whether it crossed the line into something more serious. So now the question moves beyond that hearing room. Which of those 10 trips raises the most serious concern? The Milan flight described as official business while photographs showed a celebration inside the Olympic locker room. The repeated trips to Nashville to visit Alexis Wilkins, the luxury hunting retreat in Texas, or the night when investigators responding to a mass shooting drove through a snowstorm because aircraft were unavailable. Drop your thoughts in the comments below because this story is not over. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to like the video so more people can see it. Share it with someone who follows congressional oversight or federal accountability. And if you want clear explanations of moments like this as they unfold in Washington, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next hearing may already be on the calendar, and the next set of documents may already be sitting on someone's desk.